Bloodborne is one of those iconic games that lives long in the memories of those who have played it. In a time before Elden Ring was unleashed unto the masses, Bloodborne was arguably the most celebrated FromSoft title. Despite sharing many of the core design elements that have become synonymous with their games, at the time of its release, Bloodborne marked the biggest departure from the standard Souls experience. A few key changes to the combat system drastically altered the dynamic and overall feel of the adventure, making it stand out as its own beast entirely. Furthermore, the game's Victorian-esque Gothic setting, combined with Lovecraftian themes and motifs, serve as the foundations for an incredibly compelling premise. The world of Bloodborne, and the lore comprising its history, has always been the most outstanding aspect of the game for me. Cosmic horror, incomprehensible nightmares brought to life, forbidden knowledge not meant for the likes of men lest they succumb to madness. Bloodborne is awash with this kind of chilling subject matter, making up its very essence. Yet nothing is ever presented explicitly. Information is abundant, but it's scattered across the game, and the player is never given any specific reason to pursue it. It's simply there if you're curious, and those who spend time uncovering its secrets learn of man's folly, his arrogant yearning for power far beyond his comprehension, and the devastating consequences that follows. It is truly fascinating and makes for one of the most irresistible worlds I have ever seen in a video game. But that's exactly what Bloodborne is, a video game, and without solid gameplay there's only so much you can achieve with lore and history. It is the defining aspect of the medium after all. Fortunately, Bloodborne remains true to the FromSoft design ethos, and whilst it does encourage a particular style of combat, this ends up being not just one of the game's biggest strengths, but also one of its most distinctive qualities. This video will explore gameplay and some of the lore as well, so there will be spoilers. Keep in mind that a lot of it is open to interpretation, and what I say here is what I have gathered from my own personal research. Let's talk about Bloodborne.
We are born of the blood, made men by the blood, undone by the blood. Our eyes are yet to open. Fear the old blood.
In the world of Bloodborne, there exist these cosmic, multi-dimensional beings called the Great Ones, who are effectively gods in the eyes of men and are worshipped by the citizens of Yharnam. Ever since their discovery, men have striven to ascend to their status. The blood of the Great Ones, often referred to as the Old Blood, possesses powerful healing properties when ministrated to individuals, capable of curing any disease, ailment, or sickness, as well as enhancing their physical prowess. This eventually led to the founding of the Healing Church, a religious organization that distributed the Great One's blood to the Yharnamites. Their founder Lawrence believed that use of the blood would allow humankind to evolve beyond their current state of being. Soon enough, the Healing Church became the most renowned organization in Yharnam, but unbeknownst to everyone, this blood ministration had a heavy price. Over time, anyone who received the blood would eventually transform into unholy, ravenous beasts. This is what the title of the game refers to, a bloodborne disease. To counteract this issue, hunters were recruited to eliminate all those afflicted. These hunters would use the power of the blood themselves to aid in their hunt, but as the number of beasts grew ever larger, the citizens of Yharnam were also called upon to take part. By repeatedly imbibing the old blood, Yharnam became trapped in a vicious cycle, as both the hunters and the Yharnamites slowly turned into the very creatures they were trying to purge. We take control of a foreigner who has recently journeyed to Yharnam. The game starts off like many of FromSoft's other titles, with little explanation for anything other than some minor tidbits here and there. I personally interpret the opening cutscene as the blood transfusion attracting the beasthood, as it were, and the messengers protecting us as if we are chosen. Perhaps they were sent by the moon presence itself, preventing a full transformation into a beast, sealing our contract with the Great One, and ultimately resulting in the player transcending the hunt by the end of the game. Either way, we awaken in Asefka's clinic, and the journey begins. Upon their first death, the player will be transported to the Hunter's Dream, acting as the central hub for the adventure. The Hunter's Dream is a sort of pocket dimension created by the Moon Presence at the behest of Gehrman, the first Hunter. It was designed in a way that bonded Hunters to both Yharnam and the Dream, so if they died in one realm, they could wake up alive in the other. Unfortunately for Gehrman, though, he is trapped here, tasked with guiding Hunters that pass through it for all eternity. In short time, the player arrives in central Yharnam, possibly the most brutal opening level in the Soulsborne series. In fact, I would say it's the most difficult area in the entire game, outside of the DLC, culminating in what I believe is the most difficult boss in the entire game, again outside of the DLC. Central Yharnam, and particularly Father Gascoigne, can be extremely challenging for first-time players who are still wrapping their heads around the game's systems and the overall flow of combat. Just like Sekiro, this game has what I call an adjustment period, a length of time at the start of the adventure where you will die countless times before really getting used to the game's style of play. I don't think it's quite as harsh as Sekiro's, but it's still arguably the toughest portion of the game. Succeeding in the face of Bloodborne's challenge calls for aggression, but it's certainly not unbridled aggression. It can be ferocious in its execution, but there is always a certain finesse required to get the best results. Knowing when to perform a fast dodge or go in for a counterattack, understanding when to use the gun parry, and most importantly, combining all of these things together. Combat in this game is fast and frantic, rarely slowing down, and encounters have been designed with this in mind. Bosses in Bloodborne punish passive playstyles, the two standout examples for me being Father Gascoigne and the Orphan of Kos, which incidentally are the two hardest bosses in the game in my opinion. There are many elements that facilitate this fast aggressive style, including the assortment of weapons. At the start of the adventure, Bloodborne offers 3 right-handed options, the threaded cane, the hunter axe, and the iconic saw cleaver. Initially, this does feel rather limited. In fact, there are only 26 right-handed weapons total, including those found in the DLC. Compare that to something like Dark Souls 2, for example, which contains 25 different categories of weapons, with the total number being well past 100. But Bloodborne offers something unique, trick weapons, capable of transforming into an alternate state with its own moveset. What's more is they can be transformed mid-swing to deal big damage, and it flows wonderfully. Because of this, every trick weapon is highly distinct and they have a lot of depth to their attacks. Changing your weapon is enough to alter the dynamic of the game in a big way while still maintaining that aggressiveness, and it's loads of fun to do so. Bloodborne puts real emphasis on quality over quantity, and this is far from the only example of it. The rally system encourages aggressiveness in an organic manner. It's a very simple mechanic that has a massive influence on combat as a whole. The 5-second window you're given to regain some of your health is fairly generous, especially in hindsight, but committing to offense can be a huge hurdle to overcome. Backing off and healing after taking damage is almost an instinctive response, which is accentuated by how plentiful blood vials are. They drop from normal enemies, meaning you can farm them at your leisure, or better yet, purchase them in the Hunter's Dream. You can hold up to 20 at a time for immediate use, so why wouldn't you use them? This is a massive change from the limited Estus flasks in the Souls games. It means mistakes are not punished quite as heavily, as you can just top yourself up with blood vials and then top them up by killing enemies. Adjusting your playstyle to make use of the rally system is crucial to surviving encounters though, as enemies are more aggressive than ever before, but even after you arrive at that realization, there's always a thought in the back of your head, pondering whether you should heal yourself manually or not. Furthermore, the character you control is an agile fighter, with the overall weight of movement feeling light. You can perform fast dodges repeatedly, putting distance between yourself and the enemy, which does afford you time to consume blood vials, but that may very well work against you if you slip into the habit of prioritizing them instead of using the rally system to its full effect. This kind of fast fighting style plays into the lore of the game. Hunters rely on their speed as heavy armor does not provide enough protection against the beasts. And then there's the gun parry, which can also be a significant hurdle to overcome. You want to make use of it as much as you can, because the damage is immense and it's super satisfying to follow up with a visceral attack, even more so if you recover all of your lost health. I remember dying so often on my initial playthrough, trying to figure out when exactly the best time to shoot my handgun was. It's something that requires practice, consistent trial and error, but when you do become proficient at it, it is one of the most gratifying things to execute in succession, and it feels amazing to defeat bosses with this technique. These mechanics work in tandem with one another beautifully, creating a risk versus reward dynamic that makes combat thrilling, full of adrenaline, quick decision making, and an incredible sense of catharsis at the end of it all. But that adjustment period, it is savage, particularly if this is your first FromSoft game. It wasn't even my first when I played it, and yet one of the biggest things that stood out to me was how long it took to get past Central Yharnam and Father Gascoigne. I was stuck here for hours, to the point where the game did start to drag, admittedly. I knew that I could only get better from here though, and sure enough, after much persistence, that's exactly what happened. The fight with Gascoigne is really tough. His arena is littered with gravestones, so despite it being a large space, it's full of tight areas limiting your movement. Rallying and gun parrying are essential in this fight, and I feel the arena was designed to emphasize that. Finally defeating him was one of the most memorable moments I had when playing this game. Past Central Yharnam is the Cathedral Ward, and this is where the game opens up a bit. The interconnectivity of the world shines brightest here, and it's a type of design where FromSoft reign as the undisputed kings. Yharnam and its supporting areas are deftly strung together, with alternate pathways and most importantly, shortcuts, which is something I always appreciate. But gone are the days of the all-encompassing interconnectivity as seen in the original Dark Souls, or even Dark Souls 2's hub zone retaining connection to the world. Instead, Bloodborne has a separate hub zone that can only be reached through interaction with lanterns, and a few areas that are detached from Yharnam altogether, which you access through special means. I imagine this was done to allow for greater creativity, and they certainly achieved that. Cainhurst Castle is one of my favourite areas in the game. It reminds me a lot of the painted world of Ariamis from Dark Souls, and the Nightmare of Mensis as well as the Nightmare Frontier both possess a distinct otherworldly quality that makes them stand out. None of the major areas are excessively large, and most of them are fairly linear as well. It doesn't take too long to find bosses, as there is only so much you can explore, but that never seems to take away from the scale of the world. Unfortunately though, if you ever want to fast travel to an area, you have to return to the Hunter's Dream every single time. This is one of the few complaints I have with the game. There's too much back and forth with this setup, too many loading screens. In all fairness, this is just a minor annoyance, but over the course of the adventure it does start to add up, especially if you ever find yourself farming blood vials, or echoes, or if you want to increase your stats, etc, etc. Anyway, reaching Old Yharnam is when you'll likely notice a change in lighting and contrast throughout the game as the sun sets, which is the first of 3 moon cycles. This even brings some changes to the world itself in the form of dialogue from NPCs, certain enemies disappearing, some differences in what music plays, and much more. It is particularly noticeable if you head back to Central Yharnam, where a completely different shaded sky envelops the region, and I've always found this to be a really nice touch. It brings out the graphics and level of detail in each area wonderfully. I said this in my Elden Ring video, but one of my favourite aspects of FromSoft games is the different forms of architecture present within each one, and Bloodborne delivers on that front and then some. Yharnam's architecture takes inspiration from pre-industrial Europe. It has a certain elegance about it that is just a joy to behold, and the interior architecture in Cainhurst Castle is lovely as well. At the end of Old Yharnam is the Blood-Starved Beast, and this is another fight that can be very challenging for new players. Having to deal with the beast's poison on top of its aggressiveness is what really tips this fight over the edge, I feel. Cathedral Ward and its surrounding areas are also where the game's atmosphere starts to rise in haunting crescendo. It's an aspect of the game I cannot praise enough, and there are many elements that contribute to it. The lack of music playing for the majority of the adventure accentuates the subtle ambient noises. There are times when you'll hear a baby's cry in the background, or a maiden's unholy wailing, bells chiming with seemingly no rhyme or reason for it. But peppered on top of that are the most fiendish, blood-curdling screams from enemies. I especially hate this low-pitched gurgle from the brain-suckers. I swear to Christ, this would not be out of place in a death metal song. This game's atmosphere is absolutely marvelous. Exploration is so unsettling, and complementing this is the positively gruesome enemy design. Bloodborne is without a doubt the most visually disturbing video game I have ever played, but there's an almost tantalizing appeal to that, as if it's inviting us with overwhelming allure to see what lies beyond. The Hemwick Churnell Lane is one of the few locations connected to Yharnam that offers a slightly different aesthetic. The place is basically one big mass grave, with old hags who collect materials from the deceased. At the end of the lane is an encounter with the Witches of Hemwick, probably the most underwhelming boss in the whole game. It's almost laughably easy. Arriving in Byrgenwerth and the subsequent boss battle with Rom the Vacuous Spider is the base game's turning point and its effective halfway point as well. Byrgenwerth is the root of everything in this game's lore. It was they who discovered the existence of the Great Ones, and by extension the Old Blood. Residing at the top of the academy is Master Willem. Willem and his fellow scholars became obsessed with ascending to the Great One status, and to learn of the Eldritch Truth, a state of existence which the Great Ones inhabit. His research focused on cultivating eyes and lining his brain with them, gaining insight in order to communicate with these multidimensional beings. He was staunchly opposed to using the Old Blood, fearing its power, so much so that he took the phrase "fear the Old Blood" as his mantra, the Byrgenwerth adage. This eventually led to a falling out between him and some of his students, namely Lawrence, who believed that this blood was the ideal medium to transcend humanity. They would go on to found the Healing Church and distributed the Old Blood to the Yharnamites, which made Yharnam wealthy and powerful for a time, but ultimately led to their doom as the Plague of Beasts ravaged the city. By the time we find Willem, he is a feeble old man, barely capable of speech, and instead just gestures us towards the lake. I do love seeing the moon shine upon the lake here. It's a great visual cue for the player to take a leap of faith. Now, the fight with Rom is one of the more questionable encounters in this game for me. I think the amount of minions you have to kill is excessive. The majority of the fight is taking out these small spiders, which is not too taxing, but you have to be really careful about it because they deal an absurd amount of damage. Then once you reach the second phase, Rom has a few moves that will kill you if you get hit by them just once. You can spend so long circling around Rom and her children trying to find an opening, only to get killed by a single attack. It's a bit of a strange one. It's either super easy or super hard, but usually tedious as the fight is long and I feel compelled to take out all of her children before moving on to her. Anyway, defeating Rom lifts the veil that prevents normal humans from seeing the true horrors around them. By the time we reach Yaragul, the game feels like it's been flipped on its head. One of the most captivating things about Bloodborne is how it slowly shifts from a gothic aesthetic to cosmic horror. There are some subtle clues in the first half of the adventure indicating that not all is as it seems. You can see it in the architecture dedicated to the Great Ones and particular enemies, but it takes hours of gameplay before things are really brought to the fold. Once the blood moon rises, it becomes very apparent. The lesser amygdalae latching onto buildings is such an unexpected sight. They are genuinely unnerving, yet you cannot help but marvel at them. The presence of these Lovecraftian elements slowly revealing themselves in a natural manner as the player progresses through the game is masterfully executed. Lovecraftian horror is all about the unknowable, and at times the slow realization that human existence is insignificant in the face of unfathomable powers, and Bloodborne nails that to a T. It is one of the best incorporations of cosmic horror I have ever seen in a video game. From Yaragul, the base game only has a few more areas to navigate. The Nightmare of Mensis comes afterwards, and it's one of the more intricate regions, with loads of shortcuts and hidden secrets. The lore surrounding the School of Mensis is intriguing. On the night of the Blood Moon, they sent their collective consciousness to the Nightmare Realm, but since they only had one umbilical cord, they all died from stillbirth of their brains. The one exception being Micolash, who stayed as host and lost his sanity in the process. Micolash is another questionable encounter for me. On my first playthrough of this game, I literally chased him around these halls for over 10 minutes before he finally got into the arena. It was so bizarre. This time it was fine, there was a little bit of chasing, but nothing excessive. But then the fight itself is too easy. There's not a lot to it at all. I feel it lacks some depth from a gameplay standpoint. Anyway, it's here where you can find the Brain of Mensis, an eldritch mind with eyes of an evil nature, capable of driving mortals lethally mad with its gaze. You follow the sound of a baby's cry and eventually make it to the top of the castle, where Yharnam, the Pthumerian queen, can be found. The bloodstains on her dress suggest that her baby, Murgo, an infant Great One, was taken from her before being born. She's also handcuffed, possibly indicating that this happened against her will. If you head back to her after defeating Murgo's wet nurse, she bows to you, perhaps as a sign of gratitude for freeing her child. The final area in the game is the Upper Cathedral Ward, along with a fight against the Celestial Emissary, a cosmic being that is apparently the result of the Healing Church's experiments to make contact with the Great Ones, specifically an elite delegation of the Church known as the Choir. We find the Celestial Emissary in the Lumen Flower Gardens, just outside an orphanage. Orphaned children were taken by the Choir and experimented on, which goes to show the sheer depravity and incredible lengths that they were willing to take to achieve their goal. Nothing was impermissible in the pursuit of advancing humankind. You can find one of these creatures earlier in the game if you visit Isefka's clinic, where the imposter Isefka has transformed the real one into this alien-like creature. Following this, we venture into the Altar of Despair and face Abritus, daughter of the Cosmos. She is the object of the Healing Church's worship, guiding them in the ways of blood ministration. She seems to be the only Great One that willingly coexists with humans, acting as a conduit between the Church and them. This is quite a tough encounter if you face her solo, but it's made infinitely less challenging if you use the NPC summon. From here we move on to the DLC, the Hunter's Nightmare, a twisted version of Cathedral Ward. Sometime after the discovery of the Great Ones, word reached the Bergenworth scholars of a fishing hamlet, where the remains of a Great One named Kos had washed ashore. The cosmic power of Kos mutated the villagers, even after her death. When the scholars arrived, they slaughtered and mutilated the villagers in their search for eyes and whatever secrets they could uncover. It is said that they defiled the body of Kos, and as punishment were cast into the Hunter's Nightmare, condemned to suffer for eternity in a never-ending hunt. Any hunter who became drunk with blood would also be cast there. It's a very eerie location with a notably warped structure to it. The first major encounter of the DLC is Ludwig the Accursed, a former member of the Healing Church's Hunters, who has transformed into an absolute monstrosity. The transition into his second phase is one of the most memorable moments in the entire game. The cutscene, and especially the musical piece accompanying it, is truly epic. Ludwig is an extremely aggressive boss and is notorious for his difficulty. It's easy to focus on dodging in response, but the real key to taking him down is matching his aggression and using your rally potential to its full effect. I really enjoy this fight, it's definitely one of the better ones in the game. Despite having succumbed to his bloodlust, Ludwig appears to have retained some of his humanity. You can speak with him after the fight is over, and whilst he doesn't say too much, it does make the entire encounter with him that little bit more memorable. The research halls comes next, and it's another very intricate and vertical area. It seems to have belonged to the Choir, as it's a place of experimentation where patients have bloated heads. This is the result of the Choir imbibing them with water and having them listen for the howl of the ocean. They would hear a sort of sticky sound, thought to be the voice of a celestial attendant that guided those with enough brain fluid to revelation, and attempt to communicate with the Great Ones. It's a chilling area where the horrors of the Church are placed in full view. These patients are clearly suffering. There is some magnificent attention to detail here, with lab equipment and various signage all over the place. At the top of the tower are the living failures, who bear a resemblance to the patients and the Celestial Emissary. It's speculated that their presence in the nightmare serve as a never-ending reminder to the Hunters and the Church of the unconscionable sins they committed. Following this, we head into the Astral Clock Tower, where we face Lady Maria in one of the best fights in the entire game. I absolutely love walking into the arena itself. It's a great set piece with the astral clock looming in the background. Lady Maria was a student of Gehrman and took part in the massacre at the fishing hamlet. This is said to have taken a heavy toll on her morals, as we can find her weapon of choice at the bottom of the well in the village itself. She then became caretaker of the patients in the research hall, who see her as a mother figure. She also looks an awful lot like the doll in The Hunter's Dream, and they even share the same voice actress. It's said that Gehrman had developed a curious mania towards Maria, and thus created the doll in her likeness. It was the Moon Presence who brought her to life in The Hunter's Dream. Lady Maria is an incredible fight. She is a hunter just like you, and so the battle is very skill-based, with fast, precise movement, satisfying parrying opportunities, and a great sense of reward for outfoxing her. It's more akin to a delicate dance than a fight to the death, and I love it to bits. As we walk behind the clock, we discover the fishing hamlet, another example of the twisted possibilities within the Nightmare realm. Maria appears to have been guarding the village, possibly out of remorse for her deeds in the past. The fishing hamlet is based on a story by H.P. Lovecraft titled The Shadow over Innsmouth. In this fiction, Innsmouth is a near-deserted fishing town with dilapidated buildings that are almost completely run down, and there's mention of a race of immortal fish-like beings known as the Deep Ones, who reproduce with normal humans. It's hard to say with any real accuracy how much FromSoft was inspired by this. No doubt they've taken some liberties here, but the similarities are present. Since I've already talked about the lore surrounding this place, I don't have too much else to add, but I will say that I love the lead up to the Orphan of Kos fight, seeing what I assume are mutated villagers bowing in worship to Kos. It's an amazing visual for what's ahead. The Orphan of Kos is another brilliant encounter. I really enjoy the setting first of all, and the actual fight itself is frantic as all hell. Most bosses in this game have erratic attack patterns, but this thing takes it to another level, and her second phase is kind of ridiculous. The different types of attacks she has at her disposal is absurd. Close quarters, ranged, area of effect, this lightning ability that destroys you, it feels like she has everything in her arsenal. She also heavily punishes passive playstyles. Aggression is vital in this fight, and combined with her many attacks, makes for one of the most exciting encounters in the game. After defeating her, you need to attack this Black Phantom to receive the Nightmare Slain text, suggesting that this is the actual Orphan of Kos, and the thing we fight is a physical manifestation of it. The cutscene that plays following this shows the Phantom returning to the ocean, as it were, and the moon disappears from the sky. I'm not entirely sure what this is meant to indicate, but it seems to be one of the only relatively happy notes we receive in this game. The final encounter in the DLC is against Lawrence the First Vicar. This is of course the same Lawrence from Byrgenwerth who founded the Healing Church. He too fell victim to the Old Blood and transformed into the first cleric beast in history. In the Hunter's Nightmare, he is left to burn for all eternity as punishment for his misdeeds. Now, despite hitting like an absolute truck, I've never found him too challenging personally, although his second phase is definitely tricky. This pool of lava that trails him makes things a bit awkward, and it can take a few attempts to understand when the best time to attack him is. I gotta say that, besides the living failures, the boss fights in the DLC are fantastic. I generally find them to be of a higher quality than those found in the main game, which is why I gave them some attention here. And so now we have finally reached the end of the game. After defeating Murgo's wet nurse, the workshop in the Hunter's dream is set on fire, and I've never found a proper explanation for why this is, but I guess it's just a visual indicator of your hunt drawing to a close. Now this game has multiple endings, and visually I love the Yharnam Sunrise ending, but I always go with the Childhood's Beginning ending just so I can fight the moon presence. Gehrman offers to free the hunter from the dream if they submit their life, but refusing to do so results in a battle against him. Gehrman is a great fight, for the same reasons why I enjoy Lady Maria so much, but I especially love the music that plays during this encounter. It's an emotional piece that ends our journey in the most beautiful way, my favorite boss theme in the entire game. This is a much tougher fight than Maria, I find, because the man can dart around with tremendous agility. In the end, it does feel good freeing him from this prison. But afterwards we must fight his jailer. The moon presence descends into the dream in what is easily the most badass cutscene in the whole game. This may seem a bit strange, but this part right here has always reminded me of The Creation of Adam by Michelangelo. I have no idea if there's any sort of link to it, it's probably just my imagination. The Great One grabs the hunter, thinking they have been sent to succeed Gehrman, when in actuality they are here to succeed the moon presence itself. We fight the beast and emerge victorious, but in doing so, we are reborn as a Great One. All the endings in this game are poetic in their own way, but I especially love this one. I just find it particularly epic how this godlike being appears and we take its place after defeating it. I do enjoy the fight with the moon presence, but it's pretty easy all things considered, certainly a lot easier than Gehrman. And with that, we have finished Bloodborne. Not a very long game, is it, even with the DLC? Part of me does wish there was more, because there are certain aspects that I cannot get enough of. The world, the lore, the atmosphere, the mystery behind it all, it really is captivating. In fact, I enjoy these elements more than the actual gameplay. That's how good they are to me. But we still have a bit more to discuss. You may have noticed that I've neglected to mention several boss fights. Well, let's get into that. Now, I have very few complaints with Bloodborne. I can't really think of any major problems with the game. There are just some minor annoyances here and there, which I'll talk about in a second. However, I do think that there is a jarring disparity between the quality and difficulty of bosses in this game. The Witches of Hemwick, Micolash, the Celestial Emissary, they are important to the lore and are very interesting in that regard, but gameplay-wise they feel underwhelming. So underwhelming that they're basically jokes. I would also extend this to Dark Beast Parl, the Living Failures, and to a lesser degree Murgo's Wet Nurse. I feel these encounters lack depth from a gameplay standpoint. I make that clarification because there are many things that contribute to a good boss fight. Moveset, narrative purpose, difficulty, the emotion involved, certain quirks in their design, and even stuff like the soundtrack in the arena. These are all things that play their part to some extent. I'd say the majority of fights in this game nail all of those aspects, but there are definitely some that feel lackluster in regards to their moveset and difficulty. Of course, difficulty in Souls games is very subjective and will differ from player to player depending on a number of aspects. How much experience you have with the series, what level you are when you reach encounters, the type of build you're using, and more. To me, the best bosses are the humanoid ones, so Father Gascoigne, the Shadows of Yharnam, Martyr Ligarius, Gehrman, Lady Maria, and the Orphan of Kos. These fights are so good because they are duels, and I revel in their contests. I find these bosses much more consistent in their challenge and quality. Most of the other bosses are beast types, and whilst I think the majority of them are fine, they're not quite as exciting to me as the humanoid ones. However, I do love the fights against Ludwig and the Moon Presence, simply because you have to bring the fight to them to really succeed. Which, yeah, you could say applies to all the bosses in this game, but for the beast bosses anyway, I feel these two exemplify that more than the rest. There are also some unique elements to these two fights that make them more enjoyable to me, like Ludwig's distinct phases and the Moon Presence preventing you from using your blood vials. I also enjoy the fight with the Amygdala, because you can't just hack away at her willy-nilly, you have to attack from the front to deal any damage, and it's a good way to keep you on your toes. I also just enjoy the spectacle of the fight in general. I don't have much to say on the other fights I missed, like Vicar Amelia, the Cleric Beast, or the One Reborn, gameplay-wise, as I don't think there's a lot to them, and I did not want to go through several fights and say the same thing about them. To me, bosses in Bloodborne are a bit all over the place. The best ones are absolutely incredible, but some of the others, and there's a few of them, are nigh on pathetic. That's honestly how I feel. At the end of the day, everyone has their own experiences with each boss. What I may find lackluster, I'm sure plenty of people find compelling. That's part of the beauty of these games. Besides that though, the other issues I have are very minor. I already mentioned the constant back and forth between the Hunter's Dream and wherever, but something else I dislike is how the game throws you straight into New Game Plus after the ending. Having the option to do so will always be my preference. And then of course it's capped at 30 frames per second. I mean, this isn't an issue, really. I don't think it takes away from the game in any big way, but there's no doubt in my mind that it would be better off at 60 frames per second. I also think the game does suffer from the usual FromSoft camera issues. I feel like I'm beating a dead horse whenever I bring this up, but basically I find the camera can be a hindrance against massive opponents, especially if you or they are backed up against a wall, or they jump around a lot. I did not run into this too much, to be fair, but it's never a fun time whenever it does happen. The last thing to talk about are the Chalice dungeons, underground ruins beneath the city of Yharnam. The Root Chalice dungeons are randomly generated, whereas the normal ones are fixed in structure. They are basically small labyrinths that consist of some enemies and a variety of bosses, some of which are exclusive to these dungeons, whereas others will be more powerful versions of bosses from the main game. If I can be honest with you guys, I don't really care for these places. I know there are some out there who absolutely love the Chalice dungeons, and I've completed a number of them, but they're a bit too repetitive for my tastes. Despite getting longer and longer with the later chalices, the overarching structure of each one is exactly the same. You kill the enemies, find the lever, and down the boss. You can acquire some great rewards, like powerful blood gems, but there's no urgent need to get them. Really, the main pull of the Chalice dungeons are the unique bosses, and some of them are great. When you face previous bosses, they can be a lot more challenging, because the arena you fight in is different. A tighter arena makes a huge difference against the likes of Rom, whereas against the Blood-Starved Beast, you're surrounded by poisonous water, so you need to watch your footing. These small change-ups can alter the fights in interesting ways, but the dungeons do not scale with your level, or New Game Plus, so it is possible to trivialize them. You can end up trivializing the actual game as well, because the Chalice dungeons give blood echoes aplenty, and overleveling your character is very possible. I apologize for ending this video with what I find to be some of the more negative aspects of the game, but I struggle to fit them organically into the script elsewhere. I hope people don't take this the wrong way, because I love this game, and I always have a good time playing it, but I feel these things should be voiced. To be clear, I don't consider the Chalice dungeons a negative aspect of the game or anything, I just wish they weren't quite as repetitive as they are. Ultimately, Bloodborne's aggressive combat and captivating lore makes it one of the more engaging FromSoft titles for me. I would love to see an updated version of this game in the future, as I highly doubt there will ever be a sequel, but even a remaster feels like wishful thinking at this point. I said earlier that part of me wishes there was more, but another part of me believes it should be left untouched. I find the world and the story around it so good that I don't think there's any need for a sequel. Bloodborne's legacy remains strong even today. It has aged remarkably well for a game released in 2015, and I see people speak fondly of it across the internet all the time. Whilst I don't necessarily agree with certain gameplay elements, I do think that what FromSoft have produced here is very special. Thanks for watching, and a special thank you for all the views and subs this channel has received lately. It's been pretty crazy to watch it unfold, and I appreciate all the support. The next video will take some time, because I have a lot of strong feelings towards the game in question, and I really want to be careful with what I say about it. But yeah, until next time, cheers.